Blood is supposed to be thicker than water, but unchecked greed can freeze it solid. After her father's tragic passing, Josephine Miller was systematically stripped of her rightful inheritance by the two people she trusted most, her older brother and younger sister. Left with absolute pennies while they inherited a multi-million-dollar empire, she was forced into desperation, buying the only property she could afford, a charred, abandoned, and heavily stigmatized lot, notorious for a devastating fire. Her siblings openly laughed at her misery, mocking her as a beggar digging in the dirt. They had no idea that beneath the blackened beams, twisted metal, and centuries of soot lay a forgotten anomaly that would rewrite history, a secret worth tens of millions of dollars. The mahogany-paneled office of Harrison & Gable law firm smelled faintly of lemon polish and stale coffee, a stark contrast to the suffocating tension radiating from the three siblings seated around the massive conference table. Josephine Miller sat with her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her knuckles white. To her left sat her older brother, Thomas, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit, idly checking his Rolex. To her right was Chloe, their younger sister, dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a monogrammed silk handkerchief. Their father, Robert Miller, had built Miller Freight and Logistics from a single, beat-up delivery truck into the premier supply chain powerhouse of the Pacific Northwest. He had been a hard man, but a fair one, or so Josephine had always believed. For the last 5 years of his life, as his health rapidly declined from aggressive Parkinson's disease, it was Josephine who had put her life on hold. She had abandoned her master's degree in architectural preservation to manage his daily care, coordinate his specialists, and ensure his final years were lived with dignity. Thomas and Chloe, meanwhile, had been busy living lavishly on their trust funds in New York and Paris, only flying back for holidays when a photo opportunity presented itself. But in the final 6 months of Robert's life, things had changed. Thomas and Chloe had suddenly returned, isolating their father, restricting Josephine's access under the guise of giving her a much-needed break, and bringing in their own team of private doctors and lawyers. Josephine had trusted them. It was the greatest mistake of her life. Mr. Harrison, a silver-haired attorney with a perpetual frown, cleared his throat and adjusted his reading glasses. "We are here to execute the final will and testament of Robert David Miller, dated just 3 months prior to his passing." Josephine's head snapped up. 3 months ago. Dad's will was finalized 5 years ago. He left the company in a blind trust to be managed equally, and the estate was to be divided in thirds. Thomas let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "People change their minds, Josie. Dad realized that the business needed aggressive leadership, not sentimentality. Let Mr. Harrison finish." Mr. Harrison refused to meet Josephine's eyes as he began to read the dense legal jargon. When he finally reached the distribution of assets, the words hit Josephine like physical blows. To Thomas went the entirety of Miller Freight and Logistics, the controlling voting shares, and the family's sprawling lakeside estate in Bellevue. To Chloe went the liquid investments, the offshore accounts, the vintage car collection, and the commercial real estate portfolio scattered across Seattle. "And to my daughter Josephine," Mr. Harrison read, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave, "I leave the sum of $20,000, recognizing her past efforts, but acknowledging her lack of business acumen to handle the pressures of the family's wealth." The room went dead silent. Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. $20,000, out of an estate valued at nearly $60 million. It wasn't just an insult, it was an active, deliberate disinheritance. "This is a forgery," Josephine whispered, her voice trembling. "Dad could barely hold a pen 3 months ago. He was suffering from severe dementia in his final weeks. You coerced him, both of you." Chloe gasped, clutching her pearls in a display of theatrical offense. "How dare you? Dad was in his right mind. He simply saw the truth, Josie. You're a caretaker. You don't know how to handle real money. We're actually protecting you from yourself." Protecting me? Josephine stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. I bathed him. I fed him when his hands shook too much to hold a spoon. You two were in Europe spending his money while I was here watching him fade away. Thomas stood as well, buttoning his suit jacket with a sickeningly calm demeanor. And you were compensated with a roof over your head during that time. The will is ironclad, Josephine. We had 3 independent psychiatrists sign off on his mental acuity the day it was drafted. If you try to contest this, we will drag it out in probate court for a decade, and you will bankrupt yourself on legal fees before you ever see a dime. Take the 20,000, start over. Maybe finish that little architecture degree of yours. The betrayal was so profound, so meticulously calculated, that Josephine couldn't even find the air to scream. They had weaponized her love for their father against her, using her time as a caretaker to position themselves for a corporate takeover. She looked at the smirking faces of her flesh and blood, realizing they were strangers. Worse than strangers, they were predators. She turned on her heel and walked out of the law office, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind her. She was 28 years old, utterly alone, homeless. Thomas had already handed her an eviction notice for the guest house on the estate, and armed with nothing but $20,000 and a burning, inextinguishable sense of injustice. The reality of living on $20,000 in a housing market that demanded astronomical sums was a brutal wake-up call. For 2 weeks, Josephine lived out of her 10-year-old Honda Civic, showering at a local gym and aggressively scouring real estate listings. Renting an apartment would drain her meager inheritance within a year, leaving her with absolutely nothing. She needed to buy. She needed equity, no matter how small or damaged. Her search led her away from the gleaming high-rises of Seattle and deep into the rugged, forgotten outskirts of the state. A sleepy, economically depressed logging town called Oak Haven, nestled against the foothills of the Cascades. Property here was cheap, but not $20,000 cheap. Unless, of course, the property was deemed a total loss. On a rainy Tuesday, Josephine sat in a dingy diner, nursing a cold cup of coffee and scrolling through county tax auction listings on her phone. That was when she saw it. 412 Sycamore Drive. Lot size, 1.5 acres. Status, condemned/fire damage. Starting bid, $15,000. There was only one photo attached to the listing, and it was grim. It showed a blackened, skeletal frame of what used to be a sprawling Victorian home, surrounded by overgrown, scorched brush. The roof had entirely caved in, and the chimney stood alone like a dark tombstone. According to the property details, it had belonged to a reclusive man named Albert Sterling. 2 years ago, a massive electrical fire had ripped through the property in the dead of night. Sterling, an infamous local hoarder who had filled the house with mountains of junk, had perished in the blaze. His surviving relatives wanted absolutely nothing to do with the costly cleanup and had let the property fall to the county for unpaid taxes. It was a disaster, a charred, toxic nightmare. But it was also 1.5 acres of legally zoned land, and the foundation might still be viable. With her background in architectural preservation, Josephine knew the bones of a house. If she could clear the debris herself, saving tens of thousands in contractor fees, she might be able to salvage the foundation, live in an RV on the lot, and slowly rebuild. The auction was held online the following morning. Josephine logged in from the local library's public computer. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the clock ticked down. There were no other bidders for 412 Sycamore Drive. Why would there be? It was a liability, not an asset. When the timer hit 0, she had won the property for $18,500. After the county fees and taxes, she had exactly $412 left to her name. She had bet her entire existence on a pile of ash. The news of her purchase didn't stay quiet for long. Oak Haven was a small town, and gossip travelled faster than the wind. Worse, the news reached Seattle, 3 days after the auction, as Josephine was buying heavy-duty trash bags and work gloves at a local hardware store, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from Instagram. Thomas had posted a screenshot of public county records showing her purchase of the burned lot. The caption read, "Sad to see what happens when financial illiteracy takes over. My sister just bought a literal toxic waste dump because she refused to let our family manage her finances. If anyone in Oakhaven needs a chimney sweep, let me know. Hashtag tragic, hashtag tough love, hashtag family business." Below it, Chloe had commented, "Breaks my heart. She always loved playing in the dirt when we were kids. Guess some things never change." Josephine stared at the screen, her vision blurring with tears of humiliation and rage. They weren't just content with stealing her future. They were actively trying to humiliate her present. She gripped the edge of the hardware store counter until her knuckles turned white. She didn't reply. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she paid for her supplies, drove her Honda out to Sycamore Drive, and parked in front of the blackened ruins of her new life. Standing before the house, the sheer scale of the destruction was overwhelming. The smell of cold, wet ash and melted plastic still hung heavy in the air, a phantom scent of the tragedy that had occurred 2 years prior. Twisted, corrugated metal roofing lay draped over piles of blackened wood, like a collapsed tent. Shattered glass glittered ominously in the overgrown weeds. "All right, Albert," Josephine whispered to the ghost of the hoarder who had died here. "Let's see what you left me." She put on her thick leather gloves, strapped a respirator mask over her face, and picked up a heavy iron crowbar. She stepped over the yellow police tape that had long since rotted and snapped in the weather and walked into the ruins. The work was agonizing. Day after day, from sunrise until the last sliver of daylight faded, Josephine hauled debris. She sorted the mess into piles, twisted metal for the scrapyard, charred wood for the bonfire, and unsalvageable trash for the rented dumpster she had begged for on credit. Her hands blistered, popped, and calloused over. Her lungs ached despite the mask, and her muscles screamed in protest. She slept in the back seat of her car, too exhausted to even cry. For 3 weeks, she chipped away at the mountain of sorrow that was Albert Sterling's life. She found the tragic remnants of his hoarding, thousands of melted vinyl records, fused stacks of ancient newspapers, and the warped frames of countless broken bicycles. It was a monument to a deeply troubled mind. But as she cleared the final layer of debris from what used to be the ground floor, she began to notice something strange. The architectural layout didn't make sense. Josephine stood wiping the soot and sweat from her forehead, leaning heavily against her shovel. She had finally reached the original concrete foundation of the house, sweeping away the last inches of black sludge and ash. According to the original 1920s blueprints she had pulled from the county archives, the house had a standard perimeter foundation with a small, shallow crawl space. There was no basement. The high water table in Oakhaven made deep basements a flooding hazard. But as she cleared the area corresponding to the center of the former living room, her shovel struck something that wasn't poured concrete. It was metal, and it sounded hollow. Frowning, she dropped to her knees and vigorously scrubbed the area with a wire brush. Beneath a thick layer of melted carpet and scorched floorboards lay a large, heavy steel plate, approximately 4 feet by 4 feet. It was perfectly flush with the concrete, completely disguised. If the fire hadn't burned away the flooring, no one would have ever known it was there. Josephine's heart skipped a beat. A storm shelter, a septic access. Neither made sense in the middle of a living room. She examined the edges of the plate. It was heavily rusted from the elements, but there was a distinct seam. On one side, recessed into the steel, was a heavy industrial locking mechanism, severely warped by the intense heat of the fire that had raged above it. Albert Sterling was a hoarder of junk. a man who collected trash. Why would he have a heavy-duty, seemingly fireproof hatch installed in the foundation of his home? Adrenaline surged through her exhausted body. She grabbed her crowbar and wedged the flattened tip into the seam. She pushed down with all her weight, grunting with exertion. The metal groaned but didn't give. The lock, though melted, was holding it fast. Determined, Josephine marched to her car and pulled out an angle grinder she had bought at a pawn shop to cut away the twisted roofing metal. She ran an extension cord to the temporary generator humming by the road, attached a masonry cutting wheel, and returned to the hatch. Sparks flew in a brilliant, violent shower as the grinder bit into the warped locking mechanism. The smell of ozone and hot iron filled the air, briefly overpowering the scent of wet ash. It took 45 minutes of grueling, ear-splitting work, and she went through 2 cutting wheels, but finally the lock gave way with a sharp crack. Josephine tossed the grinder aside. She wedged the crowbar back into the seam and threw her entire body weight backward. With a deafening shriek of rusted hinges, the heavy steel plate lifted. A rush of cold, incredibly stale air hit her face, carrying the distinct scent of dry earth, old paper, and machine oil. Not the smell of fire. The seal on the hatch had held perfectly. She grabbed her heavy-duty flashlight and shined the beam into the gaping black hole. It wasn't a crawl space. It was a concrete shaft leading down into a fully reinforced, dry sub-basement. A sturdy metal ladder was bolted to the wall, descending about 10 feet into the darkness. Josephine hesitated. The logical thing to do was call the police or a structural engineer. But a fierce, territorial instinct gripped her. This was her land, her property. Thomas and Chloe had taken everything from her, leaving her with scraps. She wasn't about to share whatever this was with the county. She secured her respirator, gripped the rungs of the ladder, and began to descend. The temperature dropped significantly as she climbed down. When her boots hit the solid concrete floor, she swept the flashlight around the room. Her breath hitched in her throat. The room was about 20 by 20 feet, heavily reinforced with steel beams that looked more like a bank vault than a basement. And it was pristine. The fire above hadn't touched a single thing down here. But it was what filled the room that made Josephine's mind short-circuit. Albert Sterling had been a hoarder, yes. The town believed he hoarded junk. But down here, hidden beneath the earth, Albert Sterling had been hoarding something else entirely. Lining the walls were dozens of heavy military-grade steel footlockers, stacked 3 high. In the center of the room sat a massive antique mahogany desk, completely out of place in the bunker-like environment. On top of the desk was an old-fashioned banker's lamp, a manual typewriter, and a neat stack of leather-bound ledgers. Josephine approached the desk on trembling legs. She shined her light on the first ledger and gently opened the cover. The pages were filled with meticulous, handwritten entries dating back to the 1970s. Transfer number 402, bearer bonds, Series E. Valuation, $400,000. Transfer number 403, assorted gold bullion, untraceable. Valuation, $1.2 million. Transfer number 404, cut diamonds, Antwerp origin. Valuation, $850,000. Josephine stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "What is this?" she whispered into the silent vault. She turned her attention to the nearest stack of steel footlockers. The latches on these weren't locked. They were simply secured with heavy metal clasps. Her hands shook violently as she reached out and flipped the clasps on the top trunk. She threw open the heavy lid. The beam of her flashlight illuminated the contents, and for a full minute, Josephine forgot how to breathe. The trunk wasn't filled with junk. It was filled to the brim with tightly bound stacks of currency. But it wasn't modern money. They were vintage, mint-condition $1,000 and $5,000 bills. Denominations the United States government had stopped printing in 1945 and officially discontinued in 1969. To a collector, they were worth vastly more than their face value, and there were hundreds of stacks. She moved to the next trunk, throwing it open. Inside lay row upon row of dull, heavy yellow bars, gold bullion, not stamped with any modern banking insignia, but crude older paws. Albert Sterling wasn't just a crazy old man who collected bicycles. He was a fence, or a bank robber, or the custodian of a massive illicit fortune. And he had died in the fire, taking the secret of the vault to his grave. As Josephine stared at wealth beyond her wildest comprehension, a cold realization washed over her. She suddenly understood why the fire had happened. She walked back to the mahogany desk and looked at the final entry in the open ledger, dated just 2 days before the house burned down. They found me. The network knows I kept the skim. The fire is coming. I've sealed the vault. If I don't survive, the blood money stays buried. Let it rot. The fire hadn't been an electrical accident caused by a hoarder's negligence. It had been murder, an assassination meant to destroy the house and cover up the execution of Albert Sterling. But the killers hadn't known about the sub-basement. They had burned the house down, assuming whatever Sterling had stolen burned with him. Josephine stood in the silent, buried vault, surrounded by tens of millions of dollars in untraceable, forgotten wealth. A slow, dangerous smile crept across her soot-stained face. Thomas and Chloe had thrown her to the wolves, laughing as she bought a worthless pile of ash. They had told her she didn't know how to handle real money. She looked at the gold, the stacks of rare bills, and the ledgers. They were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced through the intoxicating haze of Josephine's discovery. She was standing in a subterranean concrete box with enough untraceable wealth to topple a small government, and the man who had accumulated it had been murdered for it. If the people who burned Albert Sterling alive ever realized the vault had survived the inferno, they would return. And if the local Oak Haven authorities found out, the entire cash would be immediately seized under civil asset forfeiture laws. Josephine would be tied up in federal court for the rest of her life, trying to prove she had a legal right to stolen, dead man's gold. She would lose everything again. "No," Josephine whispered, the sound echoing harshly against the thick steel walls. "Not this time." Her hands stopped shaking, replaced by a terrifying absolute stillness. The betrayal by her siblings had already killed the soft, trusting version of Josephine Miller. The woman standing in the vault was someone entirely new, someone forged in the fires of their cruelty. She moved methodically. First, she needed capital to secure the property from prying eyes. She couldn't hire contractors, but she needed to make it look like she was building. Opening one of the footlockers containing the vintage currency, she carefully extracted 5 crisp, mint-condition $1,000 bills from a bundle. They were Series 1934 A notes, featuring the stern face of Grover Cleveland. She slipped them into a plastic zip-top bag and shoved it deep inside her jacket. Next, she approached the gold. The bars were too heavy and conspicuous to move casually, but she found a smaller leather pouch tucked in the corner of the trunk. Inside were dozens of 1-ounce South African Krugerrands from the late 1970s. She pocketed 5 of them. Before leaving the vault, she spent an hour photographing the ledgers with her phone, documenting the meticulous records Albert had kept. The names scattered throughout the pages were a terrifying who's who of defunct organized crime families and corrupt corporate entities. There were distinct references to massive, undocumented deposits wired through Credit Suisse during the chaotic banking deregulations of the 1980s. Albert Sterling hadn't just been a fence, he had been the ultimate ghost accountant for a massive criminal syndicate, skimming off the top of their physical assets for decades before they finally caught on. Josephine climbed the ladder, her muscles burning, and pushed the heavy steel hatch closed. The rusted hinges shrieked, but it settled perfectly back into the foundation. Up in the ruined living room, she worked feverishly into the night under the harsh glare of a battery-powered halogen work light. Using the last of her structural lumber and a few bags of quick-setting concrete, she had purchased earlier in the week, she built a sturdy, false subfloor directly over the steel plate. She covered the fresh wood in layers of wet ash, scorched debris, and melted linoleum she dragged from the kitchen area. By dawn, the floor looked like just another ruined, unremarkable section of the condemned foundation. Even a trained structural inspector wouldn't think twice about it without a ground-penetrating radar. Exhausted, covered in toxic soot, and running on adrenaline, Josephine climbed into her battered Honda Civic. She didn't drive toward the Oak Haven town center. Instead, she merged onto the interstate, heading 3 hours south toward Portland, Oregon. She needed distance. She needed anonymity. Her destination was a high-end, heavily fortified rare coin and currency dealership in downtown Portland, far from the social circles of Seattle where her siblings paraded. She parked 3 blocks away, using the rearview mirror to scrub the worst of the ash from her face with a baby wipe. She changed into the only clean professional clothing she had left, a simple black turtleneck and a tailored blazer. The bell chimed as she entered Wellington Numismatics and Antiquities. The shop was a fortress of mahogany and bulletproof glass. An older gentleman with wire-rimmed glasses and a perfectly trimmed grey beard looked up from a jeweler's loupe. "May I help you, miss?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious, taking in her exhausted eyes and the faint smell of smoke that clung to her hair. "I have some items to have appraised," Josephine said, her voice steady, "and potentially liquidated, depending on the discretion of the transaction." The man arched an eyebrow. "I am Mr. Wellington. Discretion is the cornerstone of my business. What do you have?" Josephine stepped up to the reinforced counter, reached into her blazer, and laid the 5 Series 1934A $1,000 bills and the 5 gold Krugerrands on the velvet mat. Mr. Wellington's breath hitched audibly. He completely ignored the gold, his eyes locked on the paper currency. He pulled on a pair of white cotton gloves with lightning speed and picked up the first bill with a pair of delicate bamboo tongs. "Good heavens," he murmured, sliding the bill under a high-powered digital microscope. The margins, the ink vibrancy. These haven't seen the light of day in 50 years. They are entirely uncirculated. Where on earth did you acquire a consecutive sequential run of 1934A1000s? "They belonged to my late grandfather," Josephine lied smoothly, a story she had rehearsed for 3 hours on the highway. "He was profoundly distrustful of banks. I recently inherited his estate and found them sealed in the walls. I need liquid capital for renovations, and I prefer not to answer tedious questions at a standard commercial bank." Mr. Wellington looked up, a shrewd glint in his eye. He didn't care about the story. He cared about the merchandise. "Miss, a standard bank would only give you face value, $5,000. These are museum-quality specimens. To a private collector, these are worth upwards of $30,000 to $40,000 each. The Krugerrands are tied to the daily spot price of gold, bringing them to about $10,000 total." Josephine's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but her face remained an absolute mask of indifference. "I am willing to part with all of it today, Mr. Wellington, for a flat $150,000, cash, or a secure wire transfer to a newly established LLC account. No tax forms beyond the legal minimum, and my name stays out of your ledger." Wellington looked at the bills, then at Josephine. He was getting a phenomenal deal, a guaranteed $50,000 profit margin for himself. "I will need to verify their authenticity against the Federal Registry of Stolen Currency." "Please do," Josephine said, knowing full well that Albert's skimming operation meant these bills had simply vanished off the books decades ago. An hour later, Josephine walked out of the Portland dealership with a cashier's check for $150,000 made out to a shell corporation she had hastily registered online that morning in Delaware. It was a drop in the ocean compared to what remained in the vault. But it was the seed. The ashes of Albert Sterling's ruined home were about to fund the greatest corporate revenge the Pacific Northwest had ever seen. While Josephine was meticulously building her phantom empire from the dirt up, Thomas and Chloe Miller were already showing the first fatal cracks in their glittering armor. Back in Seattle, on the top floor of the Miller Freight and Logistics headquarters, Thomas was furiously pacing behind his father's massive teak desk. He was shouting into a speakerphone, his usually immaculate hair disheveled. "What do you mean Boeing is pulling their regional contract?" Thomas yelled. His face flushed an ugly shade of magenta. "We've handled their aerospace component logistics for 15 years. The voice of the company's chief operating officer crackled through the speaker, laced with exhaustion. "We missed 3 critical delivery windows this quarter, Thomas. The new fleet you insisted we buy. The luxury executive transport trucks. They aren't rated for the heavy tonnage required for aerospace parts. The suspensions are failing. We tried to warn you, but you fired the fleet manager who brought it up." "Fix it," Thomas snapped, slamming his fist onto the desk. "Subcontract the heavy hauls if you have to. I am not losing a $20 million account because of some busted shocks." Chloe lounged on a leather sofa in the corner of the office, scrolling mindlessly through her phone, entirely unbothered by the corporate crisis unfolding in front of her. "Tommy, calm down. You're going to give yourself a stress rash. Just take them out for drinks at the country club. Dad always smoothed things over with a few rounds of golf." Thomas glared at his younger sister. "Dad actually knew the specifications of the trucks he bought, Chloe. And I can't take the Boeing reps to the country club because you haven't paid the corporate membership dues in 3 months. Chloe scoffed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "I told you, my assets are tied up in that new commercial high-rise development in Bellevue. The contractors went over budget. It's fine. We have limitless credit." They didn't have limitless credit. Their father's wealth was vast, but it was structured to be managed, not pillaged. Without Josephine there to meticulously audit the accounts, analyze the overhead, and ground their wildly impulsive spending, the siblings were bleeding money at a terrifying rate. They were treating the company's operational budget like a personal checking account. Arrogance had blinded them to the reality of consequence. Meanwhile, 300 miles away, Josephine was playing a very different game. With her newly acquired $150,000, she underwent a radical transformation. She didn't buy designer clothes or a luxury apartment. She rented a modest, heavy-duty pickup truck, purchased a high-end RV, and had it towed directly onto the Sycamore lot in Oak Haven. She bought a perimeter of heavy chain-link fencing, securing the 1.5 acres from the prying eyes of the locals. She hired a private security firm to install state-of-the-art surveillance cameras around the property line. The town gossips assumed the crazy city girl was just paranoid after buying a burned-down murder house. Let them talk, she thought. Next, Josephine traveled to Seattle. She didn't visit her old neighborhoods. Instead, she walked into the sleek, intimidating downtown offices of Perkins Coie, one of the most prestigious law firms in the Pacific Northwest. She had scheduled a consultation with a senior partner specializing in blind trusts and aggressive corporate acquisitions. Sitting across from a razor-sharp attorney named Gregory Vance, wait, she needed a different name, Gregory Finch. Josephine laid out her initial plan. "I represent a private investment group, Phoenix Holdings LLC, based out of Delaware," Josephine explained, handing over a meticulously forged portfolio of legitimate investments she had spent the last 2 weeks building to cover her tracks. "We are looking to acquire distressed commercial assets and logistical supply lines in the Seattle area. We require absolute anonymity. My principals operate exclusively through proxies." Finch reviewed the documents, impressed by the ironclad legal shielding. "And what kind of capital are we working with, Ms. Miller?" "Perkins Coie requires a substantial retainer for anonymous corporate acquisitions." Josephine calmly reached into her briefcase and slid a certified cashier's check across the table. $250,000 to start. That covers your retainer and the initial exploratory fees. We will wire an additional $10 million into a secure escrow account by the end of the month. Finch blinked, his professional veneer cracking for just a fraction of a second. He looked from the check to the composed, severely dressed young woman in front of him. I see. And what is your first target? Josephine smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. Over the past month, she had taken dozens of trips to Portland, Vancouver, and even as far as San Francisco, slowly and carefully liquidating small batches of the vintage currency and untraceable gold. She had laundered the money through high-end art auctions, antique dealerships, and private coin collectors, funneling the clean cash into her Delaware LLC. There is a commercial development in Bellevue, Josephine said, her voice smooth as glass. A luxury high-rise project currently bleeding capital. The principal investor is a woman named Chloe Miller. I happen to know she is over-leveraged and desperate for a cash infusion to prevent the bank from foreclosing on the construction loan. Finch took notes, his pen flying across the legal pad. You want to buy the debt? No, Josephine replied softly. I want to become her silent partner. Offer her a lifeline through a shell company. Give her enough rope to hang herself. Once Phoenix Holdings secures a controlling interest in the property, we will call in the margins and freeze her out. It was a brilliant, vicious strategy. Chloe was too lazy to read the fine print of a rescue contract, and Thomas was too distracted by the failing logistics company to notice his sister's financial peril. As she left the soaring glass tower of the law firm, Josephine looked down at the bustling streets of Seattle. The city that had chewed her up and spit her out was now her chessboard. She had spent 5 years caring for a dying father, only to be cast aside for $20,000. Now, sitting on an endless reservoir of buried millions, she was coming back for her inheritance. Every single penny of it. And she wouldn't stop until Thomas and Chloe were the ones standing in the ashes. The Bellevue skyline was a jagged monument to wealth, and Chloe Miller had desperately wanted her name etched into its glass and steel. Her pet project, a 40-story luxury residential tower dubbed the Sovereign, was supposed to be her crowning achievement, a way to prove she was more than just a trust fund socialite. Instead, it was rapidly becoming her tombstone. Chloe sat in the VIP booth of an exclusive French bistro downtown, aggressively swirling a $50 glass of Sancerre. Across from her sat David Gallagher, the head of Gallagher Construction, his face pale and sweating under the collar. What do you mean? We've run out of money, David, Chloe hissed, keeping her voice low to avoid the eavesdropping of nearby tech executives. I wired you $3 million last month. Where did it go? Gallagher rubbed his temples. Ms. Miller, the price of industrial steel skyrocketed overnight due to supply chain bottlenecks. On top of that, the local pipe fitters union went on an unannounced strike at our site specifically. They claim their pension demands aren't being met. We are bleeding $50,000 a day in overhead just standing still. Chase Bank has officially sent notice. If we don't post a $7 million capital injection by Friday, they are pulling the construction loan and initiating foreclosure. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her perfectly contoured cheeks ashen. $7 million? I don't have $7 million in liquid cash right now. Everything I inherited is tied up in this building or my offshore mutual funds, which take 60 days to liquidate without massive penalties. Then you need to find a partner, Gallagher said grimly. Or you lose the building, the land, and the $20 million you've already sunk into it. Chloe was trapped. She couldn't ask Thomas. His logistics company was actively drowning, and he had already refused to answer her calls. Her wealthy friends were fair-weather companions who would sooner gossip about her bankruptcy than offer a loan. It was perfectly orchestrated desperation. What Chloe didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was that the supply chain bottlenecks and the sudden union strike were entirely manufactured. 2 weeks prior, an anonymous corporate entity had quietly bought out the regional distribution of the specific structural steel the sovereign required, creating artificial scarcity. Concurrently, a massive, untraceable donation had been deposited into the local pipefitters' union strike fund, giving the workers the financial security to walk off Chloe's job site. Josephine Miller had engineered the crisis from her heavily guarded, soot-stained plot in Oakhaven, funding the sabotage with stacks of 1934 $100 bills laundered through a dozen dummy corporations. Just as Chloe was about to hyperventilate into her wine glass, her phone rang. The caller ID displayed an unknown Seattle number. "Hello," she snapped. "Am I speaking with Chloe Miller?" A smooth, baritone voice inquired. "My name is Gregory Finch. I am a senior partner at Perkins Coie. I represent Phoenix Holdings LLC, a private equity firm. My clients have been monitoring the challenges surrounding your Bellevue development. They believe the property has immense potential and are prepared to offer a private mezzanine financing package to clear your debts and finalize construction." Chloe's heart leaped. It was a lifeline from the gods. "How much are they offering?" $10 million, transferred into your escrow account by tomorrow morning," Finch replied smoothly. They met that afternoon in the austere, mahogany-lined conference rooms of Perkins Coie. Finch slid a thick, imposing stack of legal documents across the table. "The terms are standard for distressed asset rescue, Ms. Miller," Finch explained, pointing to the bottom lines with a gold Montblanc pen. "Phoenix Holdings provides the $10 million. In exchange, we take a 49% non-voting equity stake in the sovereign. However, because of the high-risk nature of this 11th-hour rescue, there is a strict performance clause. The strike must be resolved, and the project must resume full construction within 72 hours of the wire transfer. If the site remains dormant, the loan defaults into a total equity transfer to protect my client's investment." Chloe barely skimmed the documents. She saw the $10 million and the promise of saving her reputation. She didn't have her own lawyers review the contract. She couldn't afford their hourly rates anymore anyway. 72 hours is fine," Chloe said dismissively, signing her name with a flourish. "With the cash in hand, Gallagher can pay the union their extortion money and get the cranes moving again." "Excellent doing business with you, Ms. Miller," Finch smiled, slipping the signed contract into his briefcase. The $10 million hit Chloe's account the next morning. She immediately wired the funds to Gallagher Construction, but the cranes didn't move. When Chloe drove to the site 48 hours later, expecting to see a hive of activity, it was a ghost town. Panicked, she called Gallagher. "David, why isn't anyone working? You have the money." "Ms. Miller." Gallagher's voice was hollow. "The union rejected the settlement. They said they received a better offer to work exclusively on a new Amazon fulfillment center in Kent, and our steel supplier just filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We can't source materials. The site is dead." Chloe dropped her phone. The pavement rushed up to meet her. 72 hours expired. The trap snapped shut with brutal legal precision. The following Monday, Chloe received a certified letter from Perkins Coie. Because the performance clause was breached, Phoenix Holdings was executing its right to seize the remaining 51% equity in the sovereign. Chloe's ownership was completely wiped out. She was left with no building, zero liquid assets, and a mountain of personal debt she had leveraged to start the project. She had been financially decapitated, and she didn't even know the executioner's name. While Chloe was being systematically stripped of her wealth, Thomas Miller was fighting a war on multiple fronts, and he was losing catastrophically. Miller Freight and Logistics was the crown jewel of their father's empire. Robert Miller had spent 30 years building a reputation for relentless reliability. Thomas had dismantled that reputation in less than 6 months, after losing the massive Boeing contract due to his arrogant mismanagement of the trucking fleet. Panic had set in. But the true nightmare began when a ghost competitor entered the Pacific Northwest market. They called themselves Cascadia Global Transit. They seemed to appear out of thin air, armed with a fleet of brand new, top-of-the-line Peterbilt trucks and an aggressively flawless logistical software system. Thomas stood in his glass-walled office overlooking the Seattle shipping yards, his tie undone, staring at the quarterly earnings report. It was a bloodbath. "How are they doing this?" Thomas demanded, throwing the financial dossier at his chief financial officer, a weary man named Harrison Brooks. "Cascadia Global is underbidding us by 30% on the Weyerhaeuser timber route. They are operating at a massive loss. It's economically impossible. They have limitless private backing," Brooks replied, wiping his brow. "Whoever is funding Cascadia doesn't care about short-term profit. They're employing a predatory pricing strategy specifically designed to starve us out of the market. And it's working, Thomas. They aren't just taking our clients. They are taking our infrastructure." Thomas's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" "They are poaching our talent," Brooks said softly. "This morning, our 3 best regional dispatch managers resigned. Cascadia offered them double their current salaries and full signing bonuses paid in cash. We don't have the liquidity to match that. Because of the Boeing fallout, our credit rating has been downgraded to junk status. We can't even buy gas for the trucks without paying up front." Thomas felt a cold sweat prickle the back of his neck. His father's company, a $60 million behemoth, was suffocating. He needed cash to weather the storm, to match Cascadia's aggressive pricing until the phantom competitor went bankrupt. "Find us a private equity firm," Thomas ordered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and fear. "Traditional banks won't touch us right now. Find a vulture fund. I don't care about the interest rates." 3 days later, Thomas found himself sitting in a heavily shadowed boardroom in downtown Seattle. Across from him was a representative from Ironwood Capital Partners, a boutique, aggressive lending firm known for funding high-risk corporate bailouts. "Your financials are atrocious, Mr. Miller," the Ironwood executive stated bluntly, tossing Miller Freight's ledger onto the table. "You are hemorrhaging clients, your fleet is deteriorating, and your operating capital is non-existent. A loan of $25 million to stabilize your operations is an immense risk. The company has the infrastructure," Thomas pleaded, his usual arrogant swagger entirely absent. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate man drowning in his own incompetence. "We just need a bridge loan to outlast this new competitor, Cascadia Global. Once they burn through their venture capital, we will reclaim our market share." The executive steepled his fingers. "Ironwood is willing to extend the $25 million. However, the collateral requirements will be absolute. We require a lien on the company's entire physical fleet. Furthermore, we require you to pledge your personal voting shares of Miller Freight, as well as the deed to the Miller family estate in Bellevue." Thomas choked. "My home? You want me to put up the family estate? We require collateral that ensures you will not simply declare corporate bankruptcy and walk away, Mr. Miller. Your father's estate is valued at $12 million. The voting shares give us control if you default. Those are the terms. Sign, or Miller Freight is insolvent by the end of the month." Thomas thought of his father. He thought of the legacy he had stolen from Josephine. He had always believed he was the rightful heir, the sharp business mind. He couldn't let it collapse. He couldn't lose face in front of the Seattle elite. With a shaking hand, Thomas signed the collateral agreements, pledging everything he owned to Ironwood Capital Partners. Far away, in the quiet, fire-scarred woods of Oakhaven, Josephine sat in her heavily fortified RV, staring at the glow of 3 encrypted laptop monitors. On the left screen was the ownership structure of Cascadia Global Transit, leading directly to her Delaware shell company. On the right screen was the funding pipeline for Ironwood Capital Partners, showing a massive influx of capital provided by Phoenix Holdings LLC. She had used Albert Sterling's buried millions to build the hammer, and she had used the same millions to build the anvil. Thomas had just placed his entire life precisely in the center. Josephine took a sip of her black coffee, the bitter taste grounding her. She tapped a single key on her laptop, authorizing the final transfer of the bridge loan to her brother's dying company. "Enjoy the rope, Tommy," she whispered to the empty room. "I hope you tied a good knot." The $25 million bridge loan from Ironwood Capital was supposed to be Thomas Miller's salvation. It was supposed to provide the runway Miller Freight and Logistics needed to starve out their aggressively underpricing rival, Cascadia Global. But Thomas fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war he was fighting. He was playing a game of corporate attrition. His unseen enemy was playing a game of total annihilation. The moment the Ironwood funds hit Miller Freight's accounts, Cascadia Global didn't just maintain their low prices, they dropped them another 15%. They effectively began paying clients to ship with them. It was a kamikaze business strategy that defied every law of economics. Unless the company had a bottomless well of untraceable capital and absolutely zero interest in turning a profit. Within 4 weeks, the $25 million was entirely vaporized. Thomas had used it to desperately cover fuel costs, payroll, and massive penalties for breached contracts as his infrastructure crumbled. He hadn't won back a single client. On a rainy Thursday morning, Thomas sat in his office, the lights off, staring blankly at the Seattle skyline. His phone rang. It was Harrison Brooks, his chief financial officer. "Thomas," Brooks said, his voice stripped of all professional courtesy, hollowed out by pure exhaustion. "Ironwood Capital just called in the loan." Thomas squeezed his eyes shut. "They can't. We haven't missed a payment. The first installment isn't due for another 10 days. They didn't call it in for non-payment," Brooks explained, a slight tremor in his tone. "They invoked the material adverse change clause in the fine print. Due to our fleet deterioration and the loss of the Weyerhaeuser account, they re-evaluated our corporate valuation. We are officially insolvent. They are executing the liens." "No," Thomas breathed, the reality of the situation finally shattering his arrogance. "No, my voting shares are collateral. The estate, it's gone, Thomas. All of it. Ironwood is seizing the controlling shares of Miller Freight by close of business today. You are no longer the CEO. They've also filed the paperwork to seize the Bellevue estate. You have 72 hours to vacate the premises." The line went dead. Thomas dropped the phone. The empire his father had built, the empire he had so ruthlessly stolen from his sister, had collapsed like a house of cards in less than a year. Desperate for a lifeline, Thomas drove frantically to his sister's luxury condo in downtown Seattle. He bypassed the concierge, rode the elevator to the penthouse, and pounded on the heavy oak door. Chloe opened it, wrapped in a silk robe, looking like a ghost. Her eyes were bloodshot, her hair unkempt, and she was clutching a thick stack of legal documents. "Chloe, I need help," Thomas blurted out, pushing past her into the foyer. "Miller Freight is gone. Ironwood Capital seized it. They took Dad's house. I need a loan from your trust fund, just enough to hire a litigation team to fight the foreclosure." "I don't have a trust fund, Tommy," Chloe interrupted, her voice cracking. She threw the stack of papers onto the glass coffee table. "I have nothing. I lost the sovereign. I lost my personal accounts. A private equity firm called Phoenix Holdings bought my debt and froze me out. I'm personally liable for $6 million in contractor fees, and I'm filing for Chapter 7 bankruptcy on Monday." Thomas froze, his eyes locking onto the legal header of the documents on the table. Phoenix Holdings, LLC, Delaware. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking violently, and pulled up the foreclosure notice Brooks had emailed him an hour ago. He scrolled past the Ironwood Capital letterhead down to the parent company's subsidiary listings. Ironwood Capital Partners, a wholly owned subsidiary of Phoenix Holdings, LLC. The air in the penthouse seemed to evaporate. "Chloe," Thomas whispered, his face turning an ashen grey. "Phoenix Holdings. They own Ironwood. And wait." He rapidly typed Cascadia Global Transit into the state corporate registry database on his phone. The screen loaded, displaying the corporate hierarchy. Cascadia Global Transit. Parent company, Phoenix Holdings, LLC. Chloe stared at him, her lip trembling. What does that mean? It means this wasn't bad luck, Thomas said, a cold, creeping terror wrapping around his spine. It wasn't the market. It was a hit. Someone built a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate apparatus with the sole purpose of bankrupting us simultaneously. They funded the union strike on your building. They funded Cascadia to destroy my pricing. They lent me the money to finish me off. The same entity orchestrated all of it. Who? Chloe cried out, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. Who would spend tens of millions of dollars just to ruin us? We don't have enemies like that. Thomas looked out the penthouse window toward the affluent suburbs across the water. I don't know, but they own everything now. Even Dad's house. The Bellevue estate sat on 3 acres of perfectly manicured lawns, its grand colonial columns reflecting the gloomy, overcast sky. The moving trucks had come and gone, stripping the house of the antique furniture, the inherited art, and the remnants of the Miller family legacy. Thomas and Chloe stood in the empty grand foyer, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. They carried a single cardboard box each, containing the few personal effects the receivership lawyers had allowed them to keep. They had been summoned by Gregory Finch, the senior partner at Perkins Coie, representing Phoenix Holdings, for the final surrender of the keys and the signing of the absolute quitclaim deeds. They expected to meet the ruthless, faceless CEO who had systematically dismantled their lives. They expected a gloating Wall Street shark. Mr. Finch is waiting in the formal dining room, a stoic private security guard informed them, gesturing down the long hallway. Thomas swallowed hard, adjusting his wrinkled suit jacket. He looked at Chloe, who was hiding behind oversized sunglasses, shivering despite the mild weather. Together, they walked down the hall and stepped into the dining room. Gregory Finch was indeed there, standing quietly in the corner with a leather briefcase. But Finch was not sitting at the head of the massive mahogany dining table. Sitting in their father's chair, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal pantsuit, her hair pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving bun, was Josephine Miller. Thomas stopped so abruptly that Chloe bumped into him. Josephine didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply looked at them with eyes that held the chilling, heavy weight of absolute victory. The soft, exhausted caretaker they had thrown onto the streets was dead. The woman sitting before them was a titan. Have a seat, Thomas. Chloe, Josephine said. Her voice was steady, cutting through the silence of the room like a scalpel. Josie, Chloe breathed, her hands dropping to her sides, her cardboard box hitting the floor with a dull thud. What are you doing here? Did they hire you to clean? Finch cleared his throat. Ms. Chloe Miller, Mr. Thomas Miller. I present the sole owner and acting principal of Phoenix Holdings, LLC, Ms. Josephine Miller. Thomas's brain violently rejected the information. He gripped the edge of the doorway. No, that's impossible. You're broke. We gave you $20,000. Phoenix Holdings deployed over $40 million in liquid capital in the last 6 months alone. You were living in a burned-down hoarder house in Oak Haven. I still live there, actually, Josephine replied calmly, resting her hands on the polished wood of the table. Though I've added a rather nice security gate. It turns out, Thomas, you were right about one thing. You told me I loved playing in the dirt. You mocked me for buying a toxic waste dump. She stood up slowly, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor as she walked toward them. What you didn't know, Josephine continued, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. What no one knew was that Albert Sterling wasn't just a hoarder. He was the ghost accountant for a very prominent, very extinct organized crime syndicate. And when his house burned down, his subterranean vault survived. You threw me to the wolves, Thomas. But the wolves had buried $50 million in untraceable vintage currency and gold bullion right under my feet, Chloe gasped, ripping her sunglasses off, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and profound, agonizing greed. 50 million? Josie, we're family. You have to share that. It's illegal for you to keep it. We can save the company. Save the company? Josephine tilted her head, a cold smirk finally breaking her stoic facade. Chloe, I own the company. I own the Sovereign. I own Cascadia Global. And, as of this morning, I own this house. I didn't steal your wealth. I used my capital to let your own greed, your own incompetence, and your own arrogance destroy you. You signed the contracts, Chloe. You leveraged the fleet, Thomas. I just provided the rope. Thomas was shaking, his face flushed with impotent rage. You set us up. You sabotaged my fleet. You funded the union strike. I played the game you taught me. Josephine shot back, her voice finally rising, echoing with the pain of 5 years of sacrifice. I wiped Dad's mouth while he forgot his own name. I held his hand while you two drank champagne in Paris. And when he died, you forged a will to steal my inheritance and left me homeless. You told me I didn't have the business acumen to handle the family wealth. I believe I have just unequivocally proved you wrong. Josephine turned back to the table and picked up 2 standard white legal envelopes. She walked back and pressed one into Thomas's chest and handed the other to Chloe. What is this? Thomas asked numbly, staring at the envelope. Your inheritance, Josephine said softly. Thomas tore it open. Inside was a cashier's check drawn from a standard Chase bank account, made payable to Thomas Miller. The amount was exactly $20,000. I believe Mr. Harrison, your former lawyer, said it best, Josephine quoted, her eyes locking onto her brother's. Take the $20,000, start over. I suggest you use it to find a decent apartment in a cheaper zip code. The locks on this estate are being changed in exactly 5 minutes. She turned her back to them and walked toward the grand windows overlooking the lake. Mr. Finch, Josephine said, not looking back. Escort the former tenants off my property. If they resist, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. Yes, Miss Miller, Finch replied smoothly. Thomas and Chloe stood frozen, completely shattered, holding the meager checks that represented the total sum of their remaining worth. They had tried to bury their sister in the dirt, never realizing they had handed her the very shovel she would use to dig their financial graves. As the security guards stepped forward to usher them out, they looked one last time at Josephine, standing tall in the house that was rightfully hers, an untouchable queen built from the ashes of their betrayal. In the weeks that followed, Josephine did not move back into the Bellevue estate. She sold it, pouring the millions into an aggressive expansion of Miller Freight, which she restructured into an employee-owned cooperative, guaranteeing that the people who actually built the company shared in its profits. She slowly, methodically liquidated the remaining gold from Albert Sterling's vault through international legal channels, paying the exorbitant taxes just to wash the money completely clean. And on the scarred plot of land on Sycamore Drive in Oak Haven, the burned ruins were finally cleared away. In their place, Josephine built a sprawling, state-of-the-art sanctuary and legal advocacy center specifically designed to protect the elderly from financial abuse and predatory relatives. She had found a fortune in the ashes, but more importantly, she had found herself. Blood might be thicker than water, but absolutely nothing is stronger than a woman who has nothing left to lose and everything to prove. Josephine's journey from a betrayed, disinherited caretaker to a phantom corporate mastermind is the ultimate masterclass in karma and calculated revenge. She didn't just get even. She rewrote the entire game board, using the very dirt her siblings threw her in to build an empire. If this story of poetic justice, hidden millions, and absolute financial destruction got your heart racing, make sure to hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves a brilliant revenge story, and don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss another unbelievable true tale. Let us know in the comments below, what would you have done if you found the vault? Until next time, stay sharp.